16 Hollywood worst alcoholic stars who were drunk all the time. Dark Hollywood.
Yeah, I did 2 pictures with Errol, one when he was sober and the other one when he was drunk.
Some of Hollywood's most commanding performers could walk onto a set, deliver a flawless scene, and then spend the night fighting an illness the industry often treated as entertainment. Their drinking became gossip, publicity, even part of the legend, the hard-living leading man, the brilliant comic who never seemed sober, the actress whose pain was converted into another headline. But the consequences were not glamorous. Careers stalled, families fractured, bodies failed.
Millions of little girls have dreamed of walking in Judy Garland's shoes. You know, those ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz that made all wishes come true. Judy Garland was one of the greatest talents of all time, but her own wishes didn't come true. Her own life was dramatically and disturbingly different.
A few found sobriety and rebuilt their lives. Others died before recovery could begin. These are 16 performers whose documented struggles with alcohol changed the work, the people around them, and the final chapters of their lives. The title of this episode uses the sensational language common to old Hollywood coverage, but the stories require more care. Alcoholism is a medical disorder, not a personality trait, and no diagnosis here is being invented from rumor.
Ladies and gentlemen, the boys, if I'm not going too far, from the newsreel and the press, evidently want me to say something about my private life, not realizing that the whole show might be pulled instantly.
Each entry is based on public admissions, family accounts, reputable biographies, contemporary reporting, or documented treatment. The point is not to mock excess, it is to separate the entertaining legend from the damage that legend concealed. 1. Errol Flynn, the adventurer who could not outrun his own image.
What about the people you met there whose reputations were already made? Errol Flynn, for example. Was he really that kind of character?
Yeah, I did 2 pictures with Errol, one when he was sober and the other one when he was drunk.
Errol Flynn's screen identity was built on motion, sword fights, escapes, horses, ships, and a grin that made danger look like a private joke. Off-screen, the same appetite for risk became harder to contain. Biographers and contemporaries documented years of heavy drinking alongside drug use, legal scandal, and chronic health problems. By his 40s, the athletic body audiences remembered from Captain Blood and the adventures of Robin Hood had aged far beyond its years. His films preserved permanent youth. His final decade showed the cost of trying to live continuously as the character publicity had sold. 2. Judy Garland, a child star taught to treat exhaustion with chemistry.
Millions of little girls have dreamed of walking in Judy Garland's shoes. You know, those ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz that made all wishes come true. Judy Garland was one of the greatest talents of all time, but her own wishes didn't come true. Her own life was dramatically and disturbingly different.
Judy Garland's dependency did not begin as a glamorous rebellion. It developed inside a studio system that managed a teenager's weight, sleep, energy, and schedule with pills. Alcohol later became part of the same cycle. By adulthood, Garland could still produce performances of astonishing control, including her celebrated Carnegie Hall concert, while her private life moved through hospitalizations, missed engagements, debt, and repeated attempts to recover. Her work was often discussed as if suffering created the talent. In reality, the talent survived despite the suffering. What remains disturbing is how often the industry that helped create her dependency later punished her for displaying its effects. 3. John Barrymore, the great profile becomes a public spectacle.
Ladies and gentlemen, the boys, if I'm not going too far, from the newsreel and the press, evidently want me to say something about my private life, not realizing that the whole show might be pulled instantly.
For years, John Barrymore was treated as the finest classical actor in his family, admired for Shakespeare on stage and for a face the camera seemed designed to photograph. As his drinking worsened, that reputation changed. Memory failures, missed cues, financial disorder, and unreliable performances became increasingly visible. Producers sometimes built work around the problem rather than stopping it, turning decline into material audiences could recognize and laugh at. Barrymore's final years included radio appearances in which his damaged public image became part of the performance. He died in 1942 at 60. show business had found a way to keep selling his decline. 4. Tallulah Bankhead, a voice, a theatre, and a life without breaks. Tallulah Bankhead made excess sound elegant. Her deep voice, sexual frankness, political opinions, and refusal to behave like a conventional star turned her into a legend before many audiences had seen her best stage work. Alcohol was woven into that legend, but friends and biographers described consequences that were far less amusing than the anecdotes: illness, damaged relationships, professional unpredictability, and a body repeatedly pushed past recovery. Her wit survived in quotations. The daily cost of maintaining that fearless persona was easier for the public to ignore. 5. W.C. Fields, when the drinking joke stopped being a character. W.C. Fields built one of comedy's most durable screen figures, suspicious, irritable, verbally inventive, and rarely far from a bottle. The problem was that the prop and the private habit increasingly overlapped. The National Portrait Gallery's biographical account notes that alcohol damaged his health by the mid-1930s, interrupting work just as his film career was reaching its most distinctive period. Fields returned and made some of his strongest pictures, including The Bank Dick, but illness continued to limit him. Hollywood blurred the two until audiences could mistake evidence of illness for another perfectly delivered gag. 6. Spencer Tracy, the reliable actor with an unreliable cycle. Few stars projected greater steadiness than Spencer Tracy. He won consecutive Academy Awards and made difficult acting look conversational. Away from the camera, colleagues and biographers described periodic drinking binges severe enough to interrupt work and frighten the people closest to him. He could remain sober for long stretches, then disappear into another cycle. Studios protected Tracy because his performances were valuable and his private life was guarded with the same efficiency used to preserve other stars' reputations. So was the effort required from others whenever the stability collapsed. 7. Ava Gardner, the glamour photograph could not show the morning after. Ava Gardner was marketed as effortless beauty, but very little about her life felt effortless. Her marriages, especially the turbulent years with Frank Sinatra, were followed by relentless press attention. Gardner wrote candidly about drinking, and biographies describe alcohol becoming a regular way to manage loneliness, insomnia, conflict, and the pressure of being watched. She continued acting and could still be sharply intelligent about the machinery surrounding her. Later, she left Hollywood for Europe, partly to escape the industry's constant intrusion. Alcohol was not the only cause of her unhappiness, but its documented role belongs in the longer story of how a woman sold as spontaneous freedom often lived with very little peace. 8. Richard Burton, the voice that could fill a theatre, and the silence afterward. Richard Burton's voice gave Shakespearean weight to almost any sentence. His marriage to Elizabeth Taylor made him one of the most photographed men on earth, and their drinking became part of the global spectacle. Diaries, biographies, and people who worked with him describe consumption that damaged his health, complicated productions, and at times threatened his life. Burton repeatedly tried to reduce or stop. The alcohol did not erase the actor, but it shortened the distance between extraordinary achievement and physical collapse. 9. William Holden, the fall no one heard. William Holden's death turned a private drinking problem into a stark physical fact. The Oscar-winning star of Stalag 17, Sunset Boulevard, and Network had struggled with alcohol for years. In November 1981, he fell in his Santa Monica apartment, struck his head, and bled to death. His body was not discovered immediately. The Los Angeles County coroner concluded that alcohol intoxication contributed to the accident. Holden was 63 and still professionally active. The image is difficult precisely because it contains no Hollywood drama, no audience, no final speech, only a fall in an apartment and time passing without help. 10. Montgomery Clift. The longest suicide was a life, not a headline. After a 1956 automobile crash altered Montgomery Clift's face and left him in chronic pain, his dependence on alcohol and medication deepened. The injuries changed how studios photographed him and complicated a career already shaped by anxiety, insomnia, and resistance to Hollywood's preferred leading man image. The phrase, "the longest suicide in Hollywood history," has often been attached to Clift's final decade. The label turns 10 difficult years into a single verdict. He continued working after the crash in films including The Young Lions, Wild River, The Misfits, and Judgment at Nuremberg, which brought another Academy Award nomination. Those performances prove that the career did not simply stop at the roadside. Pain, alcohol, and medication complicated productions and narrowed the roles he could safely sustain. Clift died of a heart attack in 1966 at 45. The tragedy is serious enough without treating every post-crash appearance as a countdown or reducing the person to a famous phrase. 11. George C. Scott, an actor who refused the Oscar but could not always refuse a drink. George C. Scott rejected the Academy Awards as a competition and refused the Oscar he won for Patton. That public defiance suited his forceful acting style. His drinking, however, was not another expression of principled rebellion. It contributed to volatile behavior, damaged relationships, and incidents that colleagues did not romanticize. Scott remained one of the strongest American actors of his generation, moving between film, television, and theater. He also sought treatment and had periods of sobriety. Alcohol was not identified as the immediate cause of his death, but it shaped decades of personal and professional life behind the authority audiences saw on screen. 12. Peter O'Toole, surviving the legend long enough to re-retite it. Peter O'Toole's early fame arrived with Lawrence of Arabia, followed by years in which his performances and drinking both became legendary. He belonged to a generation of British and Irish actors whose excess was retold as masculine folklore. Serious illness in the 1970s changed the story. After major surgery involving his pancreas and stomach, O'Toole stopped drinking heavily and rebuilt his career. That survival distinguishes him from many names on this list. His life demonstrates that the Hellraiser label can trap an actor in an entertaining past even after the person has done the harder, less marketable work of changing. 13. Oliver Reed, when self-destruction becomes the interview. Oliver Reed resented being asked more often about drinking than acting, yet he also repeatedly fed the mythology. Interviews, public confrontations, and astonishing consumption stories followed him for decades. The attention could obscure how controlled he was on strong material, particularly in Women in Love, Oliver, and his work with director Ken Russell. Reed died in Malta in 1999 while filming Gladiator. The film preserved one final performance. The circumstances of his death made it difficult to separate the actor from the behavior that publicity had long treated as his second profession. 14. Robert Shaw, a writer and actor working against his own habits. Robert Shaw could dominate a film with a few minutes of speech. His Indianapolis monologue in Jaws became the best-known example, but he was also a novelist and playwright with ambitions far beyond character acting. Heavy drinking followed him through much of that work. Accounts from colleagues describe both formidable preparation and periods when alcohol created instability. Shaw tried to stop and reportedly had stretches of sobriety, but his health remained fragile. The damage was cumulative. Another gifted performer whose professional discipline existed beside a dependency capable of undoing it. 15. Dennis Hopper, the comeback that required sobriety. Dennis Hopper's descent was unusually public because he had once symbolized artistic freedom. After co-writing and directing Easy Rider, he became increasingly associated with drugs, alcohol, erratic behavior, and productions that went out of control. By the early 1980s, his career had nearly disappeared. Treatment and sobriety made a second act possible. Hopper returned with Blue Velvet and Hoosiers, earning an Oscar nomination and becoming reliable enough to work continuously again. His entry belongs here not because addiction won, but because the career audiences remember from his later decades depended on confronting it. 16. Anthony Hopkins, the night he realized he could not remember the drive. Anthony Hopkins has described reaching a point in 1975 when he woke after a drinking episode and could not remember how he had traveled across a large distance. He sought help and stopped drinking. The decision came before The Silence of the Lambs, before the Oscar, and before the body of late career work that made him one of the most recognized actors in the world. Hopkins has spoken of alcoholism without turning recovery into self-congratulation. He credits support, daily discipline, and a change in how he understood his life. The strongest final act is sometimes the one that prevents the expected ending. Taken together, these stories also reveal why the old publicity machine was so effective. Studios could conceal missed work, exhausted crews could compensate for an actor, and journalists often treated dangerous behavior as colorful evidence of genius. By the time the public saw the consequences, the private pattern might have lasted for years. The important distinction is not between respectable stars and reckless ones. It is between a mythology that made dependency entertaining and the human cost that mythology trained audiences, employers, and even friends to overlook completely. Old Hollywood often converted drinking into branding. A bottle signaled sophistication, masculinity, rebellion, or comic weakness depending on who held it. That language protected studios and entertained audiences, but it concealed the actual pattern, dependency narrowing a person's choices while everyone nearby learned to work around it. These 16 lives did not follow one path. William Holden died in an accident made fatal by isolation and intoxication. Judy Garland carried dependencies rooted partly in childhood exploitation. Peter O'Toole, Dennis Hopper, and Anthony Hopkins lived long enough to build meaningful careers after changing course. Their differences matter. Alcoholism is not a poetic price for talent, and recovery is not evidence that the illness was never serious. The performances deserve remembrance without repeating the mythology that suffering made them great. Their talent was theirs. The damage was not the admission price.